Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. A very warm welcome to Keys, our monthly broadcast to our clients, wherever you may be. And wherever you may be, we're so pleased to have you with us today as we dive into the topic at hand, the perils of perception. And we're going to look at a theme that we've been tracking at Ipsos over the last 10 years or so, which is around exploring this topic of why and how perceptions seem to be different to the reality as measured by official statistics in countries around the world. We often find them to be large, we found them to be enduring, and they do raise questions for all of us involved, if we're involved in business or if we're involved in government or as individuals. So we're really going to explore that now and think about the implications, think about what it all means. To help us do that, we've got some new research that we're launching today, a 30-country study, which gives us some new perspectives and some new lines of inquiry, really, on this topic. So we're going to be thinking about what people believe to be true and why that may be the case. And as we do so, we're going to be exploring some of the social norms in the societies in which we live. We're going to be thinking about what motivates us as humans, and also trying to set that in the context of the lives we live day in, day out. So to help us do that, I'm going to be chairing today's session. I have a brilliant panel from around the world. I'm in Karachi today, and I'm going to kick off with the highlights or some headlines from the research that we've been doing. Then we're going to go to the US. Given the week it is of the American election, we thought it was only appropriate to hear stories and perspectives from that country. And Sarah in Washington, thank you for being with us. Good evening to Pallavi, who's back to the key stage. She is in Mumbai, and she's going to be giving us perspectives from India. Of course, the world's largest country, and one I think where it's really great to explore the current climate and the current context there. And then we're going back to America, to Cincinnati, with Greg. But Greg's going to be helping us all think through what to do with these perspectives and how we can all be better informed about how people's behaviours are formed and how we might be able to change them in a good and positive way. So we're looking forward to your questions. Please let us have them as you go through, and I'll be looking at them throughout the webinar, and we've got some time at the end to put your questions to the panelists. I should also mention, as ever, we do have some numbers and some slides, so they will all be available to you after the webinar. So you don't need to worry about taking notes or screenshots. We'll be happy to send them to you later, and happy to share with you also the research that we've been doing to give us a 2024 take on people's perceptions and their realities or their lived realities. And one thing we're very clear about is we're not saying that everybody is wrong about everything or that people are ignorant. In fact, if you look at some of the broad brush, big sweep topics that the world is facing, and I'm going to share with you now people's predictions as the year started, people are often pretty much on the money. We asked people whether they thought the war in Ukraine will end. 31% said it did. Of course, it didn't. We asked people whether average global temperatures will rise. 81% said they would, and we've had the hottest year again on record. And in 3 countries, South Korea, China, and Italy, people were well aware that the total population of their country will fall this year, as indeed it has. So what have today's study, the study that we've done in these 30 countries. So we've covered a number of topics, and I'll quickly share with you the highlights, and we're going to look at them a little bit more as we go through the webinar as well. But we kick off with a question. It's a quarter of the way through the century, of course, now, where we're asking people to think about the homicide or murder rate in their country. Is it higher, lower, or about the same as it was in the year 2000? And when we look at the findings, we find that in 25 of the 30 countries in our survey, people are saying it's higher. Even in the countries where we haven't got a majority, it's still ahead of the proportion saying it's lower or about the same. Now, apologies for sharing with you now a scatter chart, because they're not always the most fun thing to look at in presentations like this, but we really felt it was the best way to try and present that and to share the actual change with the percentage saying it had increased. And I want you to turn your eyes to the top left of the chart on the naught figure on the vertical axis. And the big headline really is that for most countries, in fact, almost all the countries really, because the US is only just above the line and Canada's pretty much on it, the homicide rate is actually the same or indeed lower. But if you look on the horizontal axis about where we are as people in our respective countries, 40, 50, 60, 70% saying it's higher. France, Brazil and South Africa being particular outliers on this point. So that's just our first piece of evidence, and I think it's a good real reminder really of how we don't necessarily always know or think or maybe even accept positive news when it may happen. What about immigration? Well, we've asked people to tell us what percentage of their country's population are immigrants, are people born in another country. And here we have 25 out of the 30 countries where more than 20% is the average guess. So from Mexico all the way through to Canada, we've got 20% or more in terms of the guesses of the number of immigrants in the country. What we find in our scatter chart again is that most countries, Singapore being the exception, the average guess is higher than the actual share. But it feels less acute than the crime study, because if you look, for example, at those European countries like France, Britain, Spain, Sweden and Ireland, the guess is higher than the actual, but it's not completely out of sorts. We'll talk later about how good we are at maths and our cognitive, let's say, ability to be bang on it when it comes to numbers. But we have some other countries like Mexico or Indonesia. Pallavi might comment on India later, where it's a really small proportion are immigrants, but still the proportion of people guessing is that it's 10% or maybe even 20%. So that's our second exhibit on immigration, to really help us remind ourselves that the perils of perception, this distinction between, let's say, our own perceptions on what's happening and what's being measured, don't always tally. So what's going on? We thought we'd spend a moment thinking about the context before we hand over to our colleagues for their perspectives. The first one is thinking about the context of trust. And we've only very recently released this study here, which is called the Ipsos Global Trustworthiness Index. We have a list of professions and we ask people to tell us whether we trust them or not to tell the truth. Doctors, scientists and teachers do rather well, as do, by the way, serving staff at restaurants. So bravo to any of us who've worked on in that capacity during our careers. Not so positively rated are politicians, but also social media influencers. So any of us on the call who are social media influencers, it might not be a brand we want to use. We might just want to be that person or be that influencer, because as a brand, they seem to be tarnished. So that's the first point on trust. The second couple of exhibits we have is a bit more on how we feel about our elites and let's say how governance arrangements works in our countries. So here we've asked this question about whether the elites in my country have a project to replace the original population of our country with immigrants from different cultures and religions. And we do have some significant numbers saying it's true. In about 20 countries, it's 20% or more say it's true. And in 3 countries in different parts of the world, Hungary, Peru and Turkey, it's over 40%. When we look at elections, seems topical this week, are they organised in a secure and transparent way that ensures the reliability of their results? Here, I want you to look at the left-hand side. These are proportions saying that's not true. So in the United States, it's 30%. We'll be hearing from Sarah in a moment. In France, it's 34%, so that's not true, and elections aren't as they could be. And then in India, however, you're at the lower end of the spectrum. And I know, Pallavi, you're going to share with us perspectives from the experience of the recent elections you had earlier in the year. So where next? Well, what's going on, I think, is the question. Now, Greg's going to pick up on this in a little bit more detail, but this kind of framework or checklist has been something that we found helpful over the years. Firstly, perhaps to think, well, what's happening about the way that we think? Is it that we're not very good at maths or percentages and things like that? That's one question. Is it that when we think, we take shortcuts and in that and we have certain biases that really don't move too much? Is it there were rational actors? Perhaps I'm not interested in that topic, or I can't affect it. Do I need to pay attention? So there's that question on that side. There's another question around what we're told, perhaps by media, social media, or politicians, as we've just seen, not necessarily the highest rated individuals on the planet, but there may also be what we hear or what we experience in our own lives as well. So we'll come back to that a little bit later on, but we thought we'd ask the public what they think. So we gave them a little bit of a preamble. We said, well, people often do get things wrong, and what do you think? Which of these do you think are the biggest reasons for this happening? And what do they tell us? Well, probably won't surprise you to learn that social media, and politicians come up pretty high there in terms of the people who are the biggest reasons for it. But also, we're not so sure about our other fellow citizens who have a biased view of the world. So the public are able certainly to give us their perspectives, let's say, on this topic. And as they give us their perspectives, we can notice some pretty large differences by country. And you'll notice that the media misleading people, politicians misleading people, are particularly prominently felt in the United States of America. And with that in mind, it's time to hear from the United States of America. Sarah, thank you for taking time out. I know it's been a busy week. We're really pleased that you've been able to share us your perspectives from here. So the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Simon. Yeah, pleasure to be with everyone today. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Sarah Feldman. I'm an editorial director here at Ipsos on our public polling team, and I'm here today to speak with you about information and understanding in the US. As you may have heard, as Simon alluded to, we had ourselves a little election here in the United States earlier this week, and one of the critical ways we've been working to understand the American public at this very important juncture is to unpack where people get their news and information, how that shapes their sense of reality, their behaviors, and their opinions. So we'll be doing some of that work here today. What are we talking about? We're talking about the fractured media ecosystem we live in, how we got here, how that contributes to differing senses of reality for issues big and small, how a loss of trust in institutions and a skepticism of those in power really fuels people to seek out their own expertise, and the risks associated with that for businesses. Credibility is hard won and easily lost, and Tom Hanks will give us a very telling example to that end later on. So to get right into it, the information ecosystem has changed really dramatically over the past 25 years. Now, I probably don't need to tell you this. This is probably something you've felt and experienced in your day-to-day lives, but we do love to put numbers to these trends here at Ipsos. So to that end, we see that in 1999, most Americans are getting their nightly news from a national network like ABC, CBS, or NBC. And that's happening several times a week. So what does that mean practically? That means that people, no matter where they are, no matter who they are going home at the end of the day, turning on the TV and seeing roughly the same thing. Flash forward to 2019, about half of Americans report doing the same thing. In the inverse of that, we see an expansion of the internet, the advent of social media, the advent of the smartphone. And what does that do? That precipitates a media echo chambers that exist within this fractured media ecosystem. Now people are on their own individual screens and seeing their own individual pieces of information that's contributing to this differing sense of reality. So let's get into what that differing sense of reality really looks like. So what we see when we cut across the media ecosystem and look at how misinformation gets across out there, we see that misinformation is really cutting across this fractured ecosystem pretty much across the board with some different partisan leanings here. So on the right, we're looking at Donald Trump and an accusation that he and his administration lost a significant number of manufacturing jobs even before the pandemic, something that the Harris campaign and Democrats put out quite a bit during their campaign. On the left, we're looking at accusations of voter fraud during the 2020 election, something that the Trump camp and Republicans put out quite a bit. And we can see differing senses of reality and people's ability to identify these statements as false, differing quite a bit. So on the question of the economy under Trump, we see majorities of Fox and conservative news watchers accurately identifying this statement as false, while far fewer within the rest of the media ecosystem are able to do the same. On the flip, we see that the accusations of voter fraud in the 2020 election, majorities of people who turn into the national news networks, cable news, and national newspapers like the Wall Street Journal are much more likely to accurately identify this statement as false, while far fewer people who turn into Fox conservative news or social media can do the same. So you might say, okay, Sarah, well, these are topics that don't really touch people every day, right? Manufacturing sector, maybe I don't work there, maybe I'm not thinking about it. Voter fraud, that was 4 years ago. I mean, these are things that aren't actually permeating people's everyday lives. And I would say we actually see this misinformation and differing sense of reality permeating people's everyday lives and their sense of reality in that. When we turn to some polling we did with USA Today, a national newspaper here in the US, on the topic of climate change and extreme weather, we see sharp political divides on people's relationship and experience of the weather. Now, to situate us back in 2023 in the summer there, we saw extreme weather really blanket much of the country. Every corner of the continental US really experienced some form of extreme weather, whether that was wildfire smoke cloaking the upper Midwest and Northeast, like in New York, where the sky turned yellow, the air became incredibly polluted, or in the Southeast and West, where extreme heat really blanketed much of the country, with temperatures rising to 125 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 51 degrees Celsius for folks not in the US. So really extreme weather, extreme heat. And when we ask Americans about their experience with this, we saw that Democrats and folks more likely to believe in climate change reported experiencing extreme weather than Republicans or folks less likely to believe in climate change. So what does that tell me? That tells me then that Americans under the same sky experiencing this extreme form of weather are looking out their window and reporting different realities, different experiences. How did we get here? Well, like Simon alluded to, we see that few really trust traditional forms and traditional gatekeepers of information. That is, few in the US and around the world trusting government employees, journalists, or politicians. Now, why is that? Well, because there's this widespread belief that the system is broken. We're in an incredibly populist moment. Ipsos research has been tracking this for quite some time, a very rich data set to pull from here. I really encourage folks to check it out if you haven't before. And looking at this data set, we find that globally and in the US, strong majorities agree that experts in their countries don't understand the lives of people like me, that traditional parties and politicians don't care about people like me, and that the economy is rigged to the advantage of the rich and powerful. This is the context we live in, and this is what Americans are thinking about and feeling about and experiencing when they're interacting with positions and institutions of power. Now, not the happiest and cheeriest of messages that I'm sure you're hearing out today, but we do have a bright spot here when it comes to brands and businesses. Majorities of Americans actually view brands favorably overall. However, there's a cautionary tale to extract from this more positive finding, and that is that this credibility that I mentioned at the top is hard won and easily lost. And Tom Hanks offers a really telling example to that end. So Tom Hanks, America's sweetheart, America's dad, a beloved actor, Forrest Gump, he, for decades, graced American cinema and TV screens. And when we asked Americans how they felt about him back in 2018, we found majorities having very favorable opinions of him. Now, flash forward to 2024, after a pandemic, very tumultuous and contentious times, and we see far fewer Americans holding that same favorability towards Hanks. Why is that? Well, Hanks was one of the first very public figures to get COVID, to wade into that political, what became a very politicized topic in the US. And that was a moment, COVID was a moment where the politicization of this issue really became fractured across our media system, with differing understandings of the reality of the situation, the information floating around, and then how people interpret people speaking on this topic. So if Tom Hanks can lose favorability, so can your brand and business. This is a very serious place where there is risk and things to mitigate against that. And if you remember nothing else from this presentation today, please remember these 4 things: that the information ecosystem is really fractured, that's contributing to a fractured sense of reality, and that we're existing in this populist context that's pushing people to seek expertise elsewhere, and our media ecosystem is facilitating that, given how fractured it is, and that there are real risks for your businesses and brands. It is critical to know your consumers and stakeholders in order to mitigate that risk and to serve and effectively speak to these people. So with that, I will pass it back to Simon, who will keep us going on this lovely day.
Thank you. Oh, yes, well, we will keep going. I mean, if it can happen to Tom Hanks, it can happen to anyone, is my first big takeaway. So that's just let's say one reminder, because I don't think we've had him mentioned on the Keys webinar before. I guess the point also, I mean, clearly lots to digest around the sources of information. When I was quite struck, particularly by the one he had at the beginning, about how this century, I think we can now start to talk about that, things are just so different. And I think your colleagues have another statistic on the number of people who remember a newspaper being delivered in physically during their childhood, not necessarily that long ago. But maybe just one question, coming back to your 4th point, because you were thinking about what businesses needed to do. Any other advice for businesses on how to, let's say, approach things in a kind of flexible and kind of let's say careful way, but also understanding some of the opportunities, because I think you mentioned brands were quite well regarded.
Absolutely. Businesses, like I said, are in a pretty good position with the public overall. We haven't seen that diminishment in trust and confidence we see with governments or politicians or media. So there is some goodwill with the public here. However, like I said, there are risks associated with that, right? It's really critical to know your consumers and stakeholders, so you're not misspeaking. There's no blind spots in how you're communicating to people about politics, about this shared sense of reality. We can't take a shared sense of reality for granted anymore, and it's really critical to understand where your consumers and stakeholders fall within that realm to really be able to effectively maintain that favorability and goodwill we see with the public.
Lovely, thank you. That's points well made. And in all of the kind of, let's say, the polling we do on businesses or brands, and in a general sense, we often find them doing so much better than politicians or anything like that. So I think there is an opportunity to show that you're different, and let's say that you have something special to offer or different to offer for people's lives. So thank you for that. Any more fans of the US election? I know there's lots on ipsos.com/en-US. That's right, Sarah? Very good. Okay, so have a look on the US site, because there's lots of stuff will be published in the coming days on that. But time now to go to Pallavi. So Pallavi, I know it is now very much the evening. Thank you for being with us in Mumbai to give us the view from India.
Thank you, Simon, and I'm very happy to be here. A big hello to everyone on the call. I'm Pallavi Mathurlal. I am the Marketing and Knowledge Lead at Ipsos in India. And today, as Sarah and Simon have spoken, we are talking about perceptions, misperceptions, and perils of perceptions. So I bring you some vignettes from India. Think of these as little tidbits I have picked up so that you can get an idea of the context in India. And I picked this up from different kind of studies like Perils of Perception, Ipsos Global Trends, and other studies done locally. So let's jump straight in and let's start with the elections. Now, elections in India aren't the latest news, but for sure it is one of the biggest exercises in the world, with over 970 million eligible voters in India. And with the length and breadth and the population of India, this exercise took really long. It was about 44 days, and it was spread over 7 phases. Now, notable in these elections were the youth. Now, it's not only the marketeers who are interested in the youth as a big cohort, but also the campaigners in these elections. And there were 18.5 million first-time voters in India. So we asked people about the transparency and reliability of elections, and 43% gave us the thumbs up. But wait a minute, as you can see, it's an equal number of people who are saying they're not sure. Now, this might sound surprising because the days of, how elections were conducted and there was a mistrust are long gone. In fact, now the process is quite strict and under scrutiny. There are 5.5 million electronic voting machines and no paper ballots in India, and in more than 1 million polling stations. So whether it's a booth set up for just one family or the highest polling booth in the world, the bottom left, or a remote village in a tiny island in the Indian Ocean, the government and the Election Commission is doing a lot to make sure that everybody can get to vote. Now, of course, in the lead up to the elections, a noise is always created, and on the reliability of the results and even doubting the electronic voting machines, though no such evidence has been officially found. And hence, there are a lot of people who are still not sure about the process. Well, this is a story about perception. It's about baggage and history and a lingering sense of mistrust, even in the face of evidence. Let's move on to another topic, which even Sarah touched on, which is news and information. Now, 49% of people say that they get their news from television, and that is perfect because that is the largest medium in the country. But let's take a look at print. After COVID, some of us thought that newspapers will go digital, but print seems alive and kicking, especially in a country like India, where the digitally savvy educated population is still low. Newspapers are still a big thing, and many of them are read in vernacular. What is a bit worrying is the trend of relying on social media. If you look at this figure of 43.6% of people rely on social media for news. Now, if you add WhatsApp, which all Indians live on WhatsApp, that figure jumps to 58%. There's no wonder that the level of misinformation is so high and misperceptions get formed. Let me give you one example from my personal WhatsApp messages in a group. Now, if you're a mother in Mumbai in the monsoons and you get a video like this saying this is a video of what's happening this morning, your whole day is going to get disrupted because now you can't send your kids to school and you will have to manage, figure out your meetings and your office. And especially if this news is fake, which in many cases it is, it's really particularly frustrating. Yeah. In fact, there are so many fact sites that have come up because the news that is shared on health, even medical treatments, and of course crime and so on are fake. Yeah. So these kind of things keep us all on edge and give us the wrong leads. Let's go deeper into social media. So 56% people in India claim to spend 1 hour or more on social media per day. As a mobile first country, this figure seems good. What's more interesting is that there's an equal split between the younger and the older age group. In fact, all of us think that it's the youngsters who are social media savvy and we focus on them. In India, most of the research focuses on the age group till 45, and then there's a 45 plus bracket. Well, this seems to be an indication that we should be including some of the older age as well, as they are also social media active and savvy. Now, the same people who rated their own social media usage also gave us what they think the average person does. Yeah, and that figure is lower. So what we are saying is most of these people say that they use social media more than the average person. It's like admitting, I know I'm using it too much. And there seems to be a little undercurrent of guilt here. Let me take you to another vignette. Now, this is about homicide, and Simon mentioned this earlier. So in India, 39% of the people say that the homicide rates are higher than they were in 2000. And let me show you, these are factual numbers and a graph for you here, which shows that this homicide rate has been declining steadily. It's a slow change, and it may not be noticeable, but it hasn't increased for sure. In fact, this percentage of 39 increases to 50% if you look at people who spend 3 hours or more on social media. Now, this shows that people are being influenced by social media and their perceptions, and we know that social media is overflowing with more sensational news, more polarizing news, and there will be enough recommended reels on crimes and homicide if that is what you like to see. The last vignette I have for you is from India in a tough economic environment and even a socio-political environment. Ipsos Global Trends for India reveals a sense of being let down by political figures and public institutions, but also more optimism and faith around businesses and corporate leaders. Interestingly, the list of corporate leaders would span right from the age-old trusted figures to the new age icons, cutting across industries. A great example I'd like to showcase would be Ratan Tata, whose recent passing has evoked intense emotions amongst Indians across the country, across the strata. He was at the helm of the Tata conglomerate and was known for his business acumen. And Tatas are known as nation builders to all of us. Ratan Tata's personal brand included a really strong sense of purpose. He was recognized as being humane, and the contributions to society from the Tata group and him personally are widely known. So there's a conglomerate that builds on its perception and its stature and its trust, and a persona that is larger than life, which passes back to the image of the brands. It's quite a wonderful relationship, if you see. With that, I would like to wrap up and with a call out to everyone on the call from marketing, branding, communication. The power of trust, as we've seen, is really a multifaceted phenomenon, and it's rooted in several key consumer attitudes. Consumers are asking for more authenticity, whether it's in the brand image or through socially responsible behavior and giving back to society. These remain stable in the trends that we have seen for urban Indians. There's also a growing awareness and backlash on fake marketing to mislead consumers. And hence, brands really need to have a clear and transparent communication. Lastly, with the tough environment in India that I spoke about, consumers would need brands that can help and support this economically strained environment through their offer, through their communication, and through the trust that they bring. So, well, that's all from me. Over to you, Simon.
Well, thank you. Well, it's not all from you, actually, because I've got a question for you. So thank you so much for that panorama. Really, really interesting. I was really struck by the guilt we have on social media, because some of the other work that we do, when you ask people how fast they drive, we always say, well, it's slower than those other drivers, or if people drink alcohol, they often, and let's say everybody drinks less than other people, it would appear. But here we seem to actually be almost admitting the guilt, or ready to say I'm scrolling too much.
That's right. In fact, when we looked at the data, we already assume that people should be under-reporting how much social media they're using. So they are under-reporting, but even then, when they compare themselves, it's really a lot. I think people are aware. There is enough noise being made about social media and its evils and the addictions, and people know that they are spending too much time. But well, it's just one of those things. There's lots to be done, lots to be seen, and a bit more and a bit more.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we might come back to that in the Q&As, but actually, what I think this leads us to is some questions for Greg. We're very fortunate to have a behavioural scientist on the call to help us understand what to make of all of these perceptions that may or may not tally with reality. And Greg, what can we do as if we're working with brands or in organisations who are selling or communicating to people? What can we do to drive behavior change for good? Thank you for being with us.
I should actually start for good. You should be able to communicate. Yeah, no, happy to be here, and yeah, happy to sort of finish our time off with talking about maybe the changes we want to make. And so I'm Greg Guiaz. I'm a behavioral scientist here at Ipsos, and we've learned a lot of interesting things on this webinar. Some that may be a little bit concerning, things that Simon had mentioned that we'd like to change. And so to his point, can we? Could probably guess, given that I'm here, we can. There are things that we can do to adopt that behavioral change that we want. And so I want to focus on a couple questions here. And so one, and they're related, why do these perceptual gaps develop? Why do we have these? And Simon alluded to that a bit. And related to that, then how do we overcome these gaps, these perils, and guide people to perform more socially advantageous behaviors, things that we want them to do? As a behavioral scientist, not surprisingly, I'm going to turn to behavioral science, not alone in that. And do so because behavioral science, it's an interdisciplinary field. We draw on a lot of academic knowledge that allows us to reveal, measure, influence these hidden and non-conscious factors that guide our perceptions and our decisions. And as we mentioned at the start of this, we're not making judgments on, the validity of people, doing this, whether it's right or wrong. I think that's what's nice about BSI is it puts the person at the center, and it says, this is how we do it. It's not how we wish people did it. It's not how I wish I behave. It's how I behave. And if we want to change that, it's always better to work within, say, systems than to try to change them, especially systems like our brain that's evolved over, millennia. We have developed a behavioral science model that focuses on 3 key elements of behavioral change, the ABCs, if you will: attention, beliefs, and compliance. And under all of these, there's a number of things that we can do, but it gives us a nice diagnostic to assess and to strategize. And the first thing is simply attention. Why do people notice and pay attention to things? Sort of a cost of entry requirement to behavioral change. You need to be aware of the thing that we're asking them to do. Beliefs. What do people believe they should do? Where does that responsibility lie? And why? Is it a sense of something that, I'm aware of this, but I need to be doing something about that? And compliance, you might think, well, it's a belief, and we'll talk about in a second. Belief that you should be doing something is not necessarily always enough. You actually need to comply with that and take action on that. So to bring this home a little bit more, I want to talk about this as it pertains to sustainability. And another thing we've learned in our work here is there are perceptual gaps in terms of what people think should be doing to reduce emissions, and what we know from the science would be most effective. And the short of this is, like, things that are in red, we are paying too much attention to things like the need for recycling and less packaging. It's not to say it won't have an impact, but we are overweighting its potential impact on the environment. And things like switching and purchasing renewable energy, living car-free, these are sorts of things that we are, not necessarily maybe giving as much attention to, or enough attention to, that we should. And so let's take this ABC framework. If it's as easy as ABC, let's do it and see how we would adopt this. So when we think about attention, one concept from psychology that's really powerful is something called accessibility bias. And this means that things that we can quickly access in our brains, that they come to mind, we deem them as more important. And it kind of makes sense. If you can really quickly think about it, if your brain's given it, high saliency, there's probably a reason for that. And we encounter recycling every day. Every time we drink a soda, open a package, things like that, we're aware of this. We have recycling bins all around us and things like that. Just type in recycling into Google. I mean, it's a nice sort of, what people are thinking about. The images that come back are things that you're probably immediately familiar with. These are probably the things that you were thinking about. It's very easy, quick to access. Renewable energy, a bit more fuzzy. It's a little bit more abstract. You might even think like, what do they mean by renewable energy? And the very fact that you have to pause, you might be able to answer that, but the fact that you have to pause suggests it's probably not as important because you haven't solved that implicitly. And again, you get a lot of these sort of different images, and you might go, that's what it is. So we need to drive that attention. As I mentioned, we need to then go take those beliefs. Should I be the person doing this? Here's where this concept of moral wiggle room is really useful. And moral wiggle room is this idea that instead of, say, maybe taking the hard actions that would create more positivity in the world, we're inclined, whether we realize it or not, to take the routes that are easier, more rewarding, in our self-interest, or selfish, if you want to be more blunt. And this is especially true if we believe that others could or should be acting. And so again, if we think about this, well, where does action and responsibility, where does our belief lie when it comes to recycling? Well, one of the things we do is to recycle, we put things in bins, and we see these everywhere, on parks, on sidewalks. A number of you may have one in line of sight right now if you're even at home or at your office or things like that. And these bins tell you, hey, Greg, you're the one who needs to go put this in there. So there's just a lot of implicit and explicit cues telling us that we need to be doing this. Whereas with renewable energy, again, you might sort of be aware of it, but like, I don't know if it's me. These solar panels would be really helpful. So I mentioned I'm in Ohio, like, hey, Greg, you're in Ohio, Midwest, gray winters. It's not me who should be doing this. It's the Floridians, the Texans, and people like that who should be doing it. Or even better yet, those brands in government that well, maybe not government that I trust so much, but those brands that I love so much, they should be taking this on. And so we want to minimize that ambiguity. And then finally, it's compliance. Intention is not enough for desired behaviors. I think we all know that in our day-to-day lives. I say this all the time. I would have six-pack abs. I would be going to bed at night. I wouldn't be doom scrolling and things like that. I would be alleviating that guilt, but I still do it. And it's not that I don't know about it. It's that it's hard. So we need to often provide these sort of social lubricants, these things to nudge people, a common phrase. And social norms are a really powerful nudge. And with social norms is this idea that we will look to others to understand what are the expectations of ourselves. And then we'll use those expectations to guide our own behavior. Here in America, I drive my kids to school. This would be on Fridays, is recycling day. See a number of recycling bins out, on the curbside. 6 in 10 of Americans partake in these recycling programs when accessible. It's a social norm. There's statistics to back this up. There's a lot of things telling me that I should be doing this as a household. There are stats on solar panels. If I told you, when I tell you, 3.7% of Americans have solar panels. You might go, wow, that's an alarming statistic, given that you just told me that's one of the things that we really should be focused on. I should really act. We probably should, but from a social norm standpoint, this is telling us, no, you shouldn't. 96% of the people are not doing this. And so what it's telling you is the social norm. And so one of the things we want to be mindful of is, are we normalizing what we call, bad behavior, the undesired behavior? We want to be very careful when we're making these rational claims that we are not, nudging the wrong activity. So to wrapping this up, the ABC framework, as I mentioned, is a really nice diagnostic to help us understand where and why these perceptual gaps emerge, and then how to address them. If people, are people thinking about your issue? If not, create stories, do things to make it more real, make it more accessible for they embed in people's minds. Are you linking responsibility to the individual steps people need to take? If not, speak more concretely, not in the abstract, speak in the concrete and in the specifics. And then if you're failing on compliance, ask yourself, have you normalized bad behavior? If you have, maybe reframe, speak to trends. That 4%, maybe there's been a 50% increase. There's been a rise in Ohio and things like that. There are things that we can do to provide the social developments. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. In the end, fear not. There are definitely things we can do. The brain, it's a cool thing. It does make some mistakes at times, but we understand it. And there are things that we can do to help course correct. But again, we want to work with it, not how it should be, so to speak. Yeah, and I will likewise flip it back to Simon, who I suspect will ask me a question.
Well, I will, and it's kind of come from it's a mixture of my question and one of our clients nice. On the call. I guess it's just this point about what we can actually influence. I think it's quite interesting, the one about the recycling, because that's something, you said, Greg, it's talking to me, I must put it away. I mean, is that something that we really find? I mean, if we're trying to change people's behavior and it's not clear that it's going to make that big a difference now, I mean, do you find that there's quite often there's just a barrier that is stopping the positive thing from happening?
I mean, 100%. I mean, I think people want to understand that impact. And I think one of the things underlying all of this is, I said this, use this word a lot, was concreteness and the things that we can do. There's been some really interesting work on sustainability that shows like just putting images on recycling bins that say what it's going to become. So like cans go in with an arrow going out, just saying like,
Yeah.
Shoes and other bags, things like that. It's that drives a sense that you are making that contribution, and it's not a statistical argument, but again, it's an anecdotal argument in that sense. So I think it again shows that you're having a real impact. I think is the undercurrent of that. So absolutely, just again tell people more tangibly what they're having the impact. Don't make it abstract, make it concrete.
Yeah, okay, that's it. So we can that example you give us show that we have agency, collective agency, even if our own part was a small part, but collectively we made the difference. No, that's really good advice. Thank you so much for that, Greg, and we'll come back to you actually in a moment. I'm going to come to Pallavi though now. I mean, one of the things that struck me, Pallavi, was I'm just thinking about if I'm a brand trying to communicate with people in this huge market with so much potential and dynamism. So you've got, like, on the one hand, you've got a lot of people still reading the traditional newspapers. On the other hand, WhatsApp is kind of buzzing and buzzing and buzzing far more than it is in some other markets. So how are brands coping? I mean, do they have, like, in terms of their communications, are they able to adapt and come up with a plan? It sounds like a real set of challenges if we're to take advantage of the opportunities there.
Absolutely right, Simon. It's a really, really complex space. And I think brands are trying the best. They are moving away from the traditional routes that they used to for communication. So while print and TV does remain the mainstay, they are looking at, of course, social media. They are looking at, I know you look at influencers perceived very negatively, but there is a lot around influencer marketing, and even within that, what kind of influencers and so on and so forth. And in fact, in India, there is the top 20 cities, and then there is the rest of the masses. And so the strategy for, the top and the bottom, the middle leg is actually quite different. So it all comes down to understanding your consumers and, dissecting the length and breadth of India. Many marketeers look at mini Indias. So they look at different parts of India and try and understand that more in depth, geographically as well as demographically, socioeconomically, and so on. So that's where the answer lies.
That's great. That's great advice. And I know we did some work together on rural India before. Yes, thank you for that. Actually, it ties us on actually very nicely to a parallel question really for Sarah, because I was quite struck by this sense of, like, you've got two people literally living in the same street, looking at this out of the same window at the same weather, having a different sense of what that weather is. And I mean, certainly, many of us on the call will, even if we're not based in the States or working much in the US, are aware that questions around ESG have been challenged in terms of what should businesses do, and should they be making a stand on the environment. Have you observed anything, let's say, over the course of the last year in terms of how business are communicating on some of these topics around environmental, let's say, protection and supporting good behaviors on climate change?
That's a really critical question in the US, and one that has really taken center stage as, of course, these ESG measures have been politicized within the political climate in the US. And what is really important to remember, and what we've seen over the past year and change, is, again, that key point of knowing your consumers and stakeholders cannot be overstated enough. It is really critical to understanding that we cannot be taking our shared reality for granted, and being able to kind of communicate effectively, to make the case for ESG topics on a wide range of topics, really, is kind of comes back to understanding your business, understanding your strategy, and the people that make that up. So, it really does come back to that story you're telling, and where you're situated, where your business is situated, and all that. And I think that comes, again, back to understanding in a really big and important way.
Yeah, and I think parallel to what there's some connections really with what Pallavi was saying, because Pallavi was reminding us that this isn't necessarily about age. in terms of how people, let's say, are consuming stuff. And actually, yeah, it's a reminder sometimes that we may need to, let's say, segment in its broader sense things in different ways. Greg, I've got a tricky question for you, but it's been directed at you, so I'm a good chair. It says, for Greg, is there a way to change the behavior of where people get their news in the US?
Wow, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I'm probably my hemming and hawing already. Probably like it's not. I don't. Yes, I don't know how easy it would be to do. I think. Yeah, behavioral change is hard. It's there's a lot of inertia and things like that. We talk about things like fresh start effects. I think when there are new moments and things like that. So I think where we might want to adopt things is when we know people are adopting new behaviors in general. So like New Year's or like start of school or things like that. I think the other thing that we can do is within social norms, I guess. Through all of this, we talk about sources of credibility. There's nobody that we like or trust more than ourselves. And so I think if we're trying to change that behavior in a lot of ways, where we talk about like, brands and things like that, the more that we can show that people like you are doing that. And so if you're trying to nudge people to maybe adopt new news sources, don't say like, hey, I as not just a lefty telling you a right or vice versa, but try to talk about how people like them are adopting those types of behaviors. So I think you want to, again, speak to them on their own terms, but I think candidly from my response here, I don't have a great answer to that, to be honest. I'm sure that's why the person asked, because that is almost a holy grail of how do we get some continuity in our information streams.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I know. Greg
Yeah,
can't change everything. I do want to jump in really quickly. I'll wade into this difficult question too. I mean, just to I think it's important to actually take a second and really appreciate how sticky the news environment and fractured ecosystem is, given the framework Greg presented to us. I mean, the social norms, doom scrolling, right? That is an accepted norm. The accessibility of social media on our phones. We have smartphones now in our pockets nearly all the time. So that's always at the ready. I think it's like worthwhile to give a little humility and credence to just how sticky some of this is and how tempting some of this is, and have some, empathy and compassion for kind of where we all are in that. And yeah, unfortunately, Greg, it doesn't sound like has all the solutions there, but some really important ways for framing this story and understanding how people are approaching their news and information. I think that behavioral science piece is such a fascinating lens to some of this research.
It is. And I mean, Pallavi, you talked about social media. I mean, is there a discussion about polarization of media? I'm thinking actually about some of the newspapers and not official sources, ones that are able to broadcast or print and distribute. Is there that discussion in India about, let's say, polarization of what the actual sources are saying to us if we're consuming these things?
Yes, of course. So the bigger media, whether it's television or print, are owned by organizations which are affiliated to ex-government, by government, so on. So there is always a bit of this could be pro, this could be anti, and people consume all of it, but there are always discussions on so and so media says will say it like this, and so media will support this and say it another way. And social media is just another thing altogether. I mean, people really spread different kinds of misinformation naively, so to speak. I mean, they receive information, they believe it, they forward it, and it really leads to a lot of trouble, especially some political issues get fanned, and it leads to a lot of it could lead to a lot of problems, and it has done that in the past. So now if there are some there's an incident, the social media gets blocked, the internet gets blocked around there, so that there's not crazy amounts of misinformation coming out from there and being spread around. So for sure, it's all out there and very sensational, very polarizing.
Absolutely. Well, I hope for clients and colleagues on the call, we'll be able to give a good airing to this question of the perils of perception, what they are, what the issues might be, how to start to understand it. We've seen how complex it is, and it's clearly a to be continued question rather than one when one can give definitive answers, but we hope these resources will be useful for you. We've got the Perils of Perception website, which documents all of the work we've done over 10 years, where we've covered a whole range of topics. We'll also be putting the report that I mentioned today up there, and it'll be as well in your email tomorrow, where we'll be sending you the deck from today and the link to the recording. We'll also put in this deck actually a link to the populism survey that we did around the world, which we didn't really have time to cover today, but a number of you on the call were interested in that question about what else we'd found in the research we were doing there, picking up on some of the observations that Sarah had. So we'll put that study there because it's another 30-country study done at the start of this year. We'll come back to that one, I'm sure, next year and see how things have changed in the light of this year's elections. So for now, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you to our panel for sharing your thoughts and ideas and perspectives with us. We really do appreciate that, and to Agnes and Emily, the production team, in making this happen. And we hope you will join us at the end of the year, where we are going to look at elections. We're going to look at AI and what we learned over the year. We're going to have a perspective from China to get a real story of the year that was there. And we're going to look at health and what some of the new drugs and the new technology available in healthcare means for all of us beyond just that sector. So look forward to seeing you in a little over a month's time. Thank you for being with us today. We really do appreciate your company, and we'll see you again soon. All the very best.